Hey guys, so our group is going to be covering the coastal shelf. Today's presenters are going to be Samantha Scott, Angie Gonzalez, Brittany Rojas, Dayanara Tavera, and Mia Bermudez.
So what is the coastal shelf? The coastal shelf is the land that stretches from the sand all the way to the continental shelf. In the image on the left, you can see the sand stretching out to the ocean. On the right, you can see where the continental shelf ends. So from the sand to that continental shelf is considered the coastal shelf. Some main discussion topics are different parts of the coastal shelf. This is including the intertidal and 4 rocky intertidal zones, the subtidal zones, and then we'll also discuss challenges that organisms face in these zones, commercial fishing, what are epiphytes, what is seagrass and kelp forests, and current threats to these habitats.
Intertidal zone. The intertidal zone is where the land and the ocean meet. Also known as the seashore, it is found on all the coasts around the globe. It is highly affected in the changes of the high and low tide. The intertidal zone is everything from the highest point of the high tide to the lowest part of the low tide. Because of the changing tides, the environment is constantly changing. As the environment changes, so does the habitat. After many years of adaptation, the habitats are usually rocky, sandy, or covered in mudflats. During the low tides, we get to see tide pools. Tide pools are small pockets of seawater, anywhere from a few inches to a couple feet in both length and depth. These tide pools let many marine organisms survive during the low tide. Organisms like these would include sea snails, barnacles, mussels, urchins, anemone, sea stars, seaweed and seagrass, small fish, and many more crustaceans. If we look to our right, we see how the rocky environment has allowed to trap the tide pools to keep them from receding with the low tide. We see how the adaptation after many years has evolved to allow as many organisms as possible to thrive. There are 3 zones: the upper tidal, middle tidal, and lower tidal. We also have the splash zone. Though the splash zone doesn't necessarily submerge in water, it is the highest part of the upper tidal zone, and it is constantly being hit with mist and salinity that comes from the sea. As the tides change, so do the communities. Organisms must constantly adapt to the change of temperature, light, oxygen, and water levels. Many marine organisms have also developed biologically to maintain and keep their bodies healthy from the salinity found in the ocean.
Then we have the 4 rocky intertidal zones. These include the spray zone, high intertidal zone, mid intertidal zone, and the low intertidal zone. In the spray zone, plants and animals have adapted to living mostly exposed to air, sun, rain, and sometimes even frost. The spray zone is considered the sandy area of the beach, so it's more land than it is water. The high intertidal zone, plants and animals are used to being above the water surface. So this area is flooded during high tide, and it is out of water for long periods of time during the day. The mid-intertidal zone is where plants and animals live, and they're used to not being exposed to dry conditions for very long. They're generally submerged, and they're exposed to air for a short period of time, and this is usually during low tide. In the low intertidal zone, life here has adapted to conditions underwater. So this area is exposed to air for a very short period of time, and that's usually during low tide.
Below the intertidal zone is the subtidal zone, which extends from the low tide mark to the shelf break. This area is almost always submerged, but can be exposed during very low tides for a short amount of time. In this zone, there are lots of movements from crashing waves and swirling sand. Some of the common plants living in this zone is the kelp and eelgrass. Organisms in the subtidal zone consist of, but not limited to, plankton, red algae, mollusks, fish, crustacean, sea urchins, mussels, and sea stars. As mentioned before, because of the crashing waves and movements of the waters, many of the organisms are epifauna that attach themselves to hard surfaces like rocks and shells. Some examples include oysters, sponges, and barnacles.
Some challenges that organisms face in these zones are temperature change, desiccation, oxygen depletion, and reduced opportunities for feeding. So temperature change is due to being exposed to sunlight for long periods of time or short periods of time, and then being submerged in water. Being exposed to sunlight obviously increases the temperature, and then being submerged can decrease the temperature if the water is cool. Desiccation is the drying out of these organisms. Some organisms have methods of preventing this from happening. For example, the clams, they will tighten their shells so that they can keep the water in and not dry out. For oxygen depletion, they're either exposed to straight air or they're submerged in water where they are getting more oxygen. And then when they're exposed to air, they're getting less oxygen because they're not being able to absorb it through the water. Then for reduced opportunities for feeding, they can go long periods of time without being submerged in water and not have the organisms that they need to feed on accessible to them at all times.
Commercial fishing. Commercial fishing is the act of catching fish or other seafood for profit. Usually this is where you get your seafood from and where restaurants and markets get theirs. Most of the commercial fishing is done in the Nearitic zone, which is beyond the subtidal zone and above the continental shelf, where people deep sea fish. Like in the picture, people commercial fish using giant nets or trawling, which drags a net through water behind a boat. 90% of commercial fishing is caught in waters above the continental shelf.
What are epiphytes? Epiphytes are organisms and or plants that grow on other plant surfaces. So as you can see in the photo to the top right, there is a brown growth on the green stems of the plant. And then on your bottom left corner, you will see that there is a reddish orange growth on the plant as well. So epiphytes, much like every other organism, needs nutrients to survive. Now you might ask yourself, how do these plants or organisms get nutrients? So they actually derive the nutrients from the plants that they are on, or they'll get it from surrounding debris. However, when they do derive the plants from their nutrients, they often leave the plants very frail and fragile. This could result in the plant ultimately dying. Another thing you should know about epiphytes is that they are found both on land and in the sea. When on land, you could usually see it on trees, and in the sea, it is most common for them to be spotted on seagrass. Continuing on the topic of seagrass with epiphytes, here in this photo, you can see that there is a white or off-white growth on the blades of the seagrass. Something you should know is that when you spot seagrass, most of the times, or majority of the time, there will be an epiphyte attached to it. Because of that, there are a lot of different organisms that could be spotted that make up the epiphytes on the seagrass blades. Some examples of epiphytes on seagrasses could be algae, both micro and macro, bacteria, fungi, sponges, and mollusks. Now, what organisms feed on seagrasses? So something you should know about seagrasses is that they actually grow throughout our whole planet. This is because they can actually grow in every climatic region except for polar regions. Because of that, both small and large-bodied organisms can feed off of it. Obviously, fish are one of the biggest populated animals in our oceans, and because of that, fish is one of the main organisms that feeds off of seagrass. Two other examples would be green sea turtles and sea urchins. Plus, like I previously mentioned, a lot of times when you find seagrass, you will find epiphytes located on its blades. Because of that, smaller animals do tend to actually feed off of the epiphytes attached to the seagrass other than the seagrass itself. What are the differences between seagrasses and kelp forests? One of the main differences is location. Kelp forests are more sensitive to temperature, which basically means that they are only found in temperate areas. Seagrass, on the other hand, is completely different. As previously mentioned, seagrass can be grown in all climatic locations except for polar regions. Another difference is how they look physically. Seagrass, much like our grass that you could typically find at home, is made up of blades. However, seagrass is usually way longer than the grass you would have in your front or backyard. Kelp, on the other hand, has lettuce or kale-like leaves, which tend to crinkle up at the ends. Kelp is also multicellular and has very limited vascular tissue. Seagrass is considered vascular and is made up of roots and stems.
And so our next slide is current threats to these habitats. You have the obvious of climate change and sea levels rising, and sea level temperatures rising, but we also have plastic pollution, you have chemical runoff, a lot of just plastic floating around between every single zone of the continental shelf. You have human activities such as boats, anchors, nets, really uprooting a lot of the sediment and destroying seagrass meadows. And then now we have, before we had offshore drilling, but that really was kind of halted back in 2008 under Bush, and finalized, protected under Obama. But as of recent, in 2018, under the Trump administration, they started the program America First Offshore Energy program. So now offshore drilling will be a new current threat again, especially within the Gulf, Arctic, and Atlantic oceans. And thanks to climate change and a lot of nutrient runoff, we have algae blooms and dead zones, especially around the Gulf Coast of Florida. There have been reported a lot of dead zones and algae blooms of more recent. And then on the other coast, on the west coast, you have invasive species such as sea urchins, which are devouring kelp forests at huge rates. And then you have programs that are actually making a difference, and these are all programs that you as an individual can go and not only do research upon, but you can actively be a part of. So the first one we have is called Sea Trees, and they're by Sustainable Surf. They take donations and volunteers, and they go around protecting not only they're protecting part of California sea kelp forest, but they also go in other countries and other places helping protect mangroves and equestrians. You also have Project Seagrass, another one that you can volunteer, campaign, or donate to, that specifically protects seagrass meadows and the animals that live and rely on these seagrasses. Then you have the Bay Foundation, and a branch of the Bay Foundation, you have specifically the Santa Monica area. And the Santa Monica area not only is an equestrian program and falls under that, but they also help with a lot of the kelp forests over off the shelf. And you can be a part of that and help and volunteer. And then you have Sailors for Sea, which is a Florida-based little club that really by Oceana, but it's a club for small sailors, small boaters, on tips and techniques and how to reduce and not disrupt any environments really, and to on safe techniques while out and about. So those are the ones I encourage everyone to look up. They all are pretty great.
Here is we're excited for today's presentation. Once again, we are your presenters, Samantha Scott, Angie Gonzalez, Brittany Rojas, Dayanara Tavira, and Mia Bermudez. This was our presentation on the coastal shelf. Thank you.